I was out at St. Paul's following a funeral service not long ago, and I was talking to 2 or 3 of the parishioners there, and one of them said to a younger person, "This man started St. Paul's." And I said, "You know, for several years I fooled myself into believing that. But upon retirement, you have a lot of time to reflect and ponder." Oh my, I do a lot of pondering this day and time. And I realized that everything I've ever accomplished in life, I don't remember one thing I accomplished on my own without help from somebody else. And whatever contribution I made at St. Paul's, I stood on Bob Bledsoe's shoulders to do it. And I've come over the years more and more to appreciate that and what he did for me. We would sometimes have a theological argument, and we would say to each other, "Well, you can't be right all the time." But I learned more from Bob Bledsoe about church administration than I ever learned in seminary or anywhere else life ever led me. He was the master at it as far as I was concerned. So having said that, and my wife's going to love this because I've changed my sermon completely from what I started out with. And I did it this morning because I was fortunate enough to have a text that tells its own story. And Carly, of course, told the story to the children, and Jeff was kind enough to read it at the last service, and John here today. And I want you to now turn your attention with me to the 15th chapter. We're still in the 15th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel. But I want to read the first 3 verses of that 15th chapter because this is what gave impetus to Jesus telling the 3 parables that followed these 3 verses, and particularly this one on the prodigal son. These verses say, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" Can you believe it? And the reason this man received sinners and ate with them is because the religious institutions of their day would not receive them and eat with them. Jesus said to that group of scribes and Pharisees gathered there that day, "You are the elder brother. Your attitude, obnoxiousness, overbearingness drove the children of God here to me today. They were disenfranchised. They were not welcome. They were broken. They were without hope. And they would follow Jesus wherever he led because they said no man ever spoke like him. And they hung on his every word. He spoke as one with authority, and he spoke to them not of a fashion and a form of religion, but of the spirit of religion. And that's why he could say to these Pharisees, scribes, time after time after time, "You're like whitewashed sepulchres filled with dead men's bones. you make your rules and you set forth your propositions, and you lay on the backs of these very people that you're criticizing for being here, you lay on their backs burdens too heavy to bear. And so they felt uncomfortable being with religious people. His message was not due to rules and regulations. It was about a God who loved his people enough to make covenant with them. He would be their God, and they would be his people. This wasn't a parity covenant. It wasn't a covenant between two equals. It was a suzerainty covenant that said, I will be your God. You will be my people, now, forever, and always. And to carry that message, the Bible tells us that in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, and Jesus went out into the open air and brought the message of salvation to these people that had been disenfranchised by the religionist and society as a whole. And as I changed the direction of where I was going this morning, and as I heard the children being told this parable, I realized, as I look back over church history, how often a kind of evil has arisen in the midst of the people, and God in his righteous might has seen fit to send forth Christ or a follower or someone who would carry a message to the lost, the disinherited, and the disenfranchised. We are Methodist. We have a long tradition of this. The founder of our societies, John Wesley, was an Anglican priest. He wanted to go out where the people were because they certainly weren't coming into the churches of his day. And he sought permission, and the bishop said to him in that day, well, now, Mr. Wesley, I'm sorry, but we just don't have the provision to appoint you to that kind of a ministry. That's, so to speak, sort of out of the box, and we appoint you to a parish and we expect you to stay there. And John Wesley replied, and we all know that famous reply, Bishop, the world is my parish. And John Wesley and his brother Charles started what we know today as the Wesleyan Revival, the movement that even secular historians say saved England from a bloody revolution. But it carried the message of God outside the temples of hope in order to deliver it to a disenfranchised, disenchanted, hungry, sorrowful, downtrodden people. And another Methodist, William Booth. In 1785, he was a local preacher in the Methodist Church of England. He went to the 1785 General Conference asking the bishop if he would appoint him to the slums of East London. Because he said, Bishop, there are people there that will not come into our churches. They feel they're not wanted. They're left alone, but they're seeking, and they're searching, and they're thirsting for the bread that only Christ can give. But they can't get in to get it. And the bishop offered his apology, but said, Mr. Booth, we can't do that. We've appointed you to a parish, and you've got to stay within that parish and do your work there. And William Booth turned to his wife, who was sitting in the audience, and he said, come, my dear, we must be going. And he walked out of that Methodist conference into the slums of East London and started the Salvation Army. We could have had that today. We all know how much good it does. The effectiveness of the ministry. But we couldn't make provision for it. Jesus was saying to these Pharisees and scribes, in effect, you drove your younger brother out. You were happier the day after he left than you were the day before. And Walter reminded me after the service last time that it was Jewish law that the older brother was going to get 3/4 of the inheritance anyway. So it wasn't as if he were being robbed. But I've thought of the places that I've found in my ministry, and I think every Methodist minister could cite examples like this, where there arose opportunities for the church, this great movement that we're involved in, to go outside the borders to reach people that are not otherwise going to be reached, and to do it in some rather innovative ways. When I left this town in 1983, I left kicking and screaming. I didn't want to go. I mean, after all, Ocala's almost heaven. And anybody that's lived here, why would they want to leave it? But the bishop said to me, you're treating that church like it's your baby. Or he didn't say that to me. I apologize. He said it to the district superintendent, or at least. That's the flimsy excuse the district superintendent gave me. That the bishop said, you're treating it as your baby, and it's time to go. And so I went. And the place I went, I don't remember if it was U.S. News and World Report or if it was Newsweek magazine, but I do remember one of them said that a street in that town that was 1 block from where the church was I was being sent to, it was the sleaze capital of the United States. And I didn't want to go there. And we got there, and it was an eye-opener to me. I stepped out of my office the first week I was there, and I was propositioned. I'd never been propositioned in my life. I couldn't wait to get home and tell Rosalie. And there were little kids running around there. They didn't have a children's Sunday school class, and Rosalie started one. And I said, isn't this discouraging, because they're going to be gone next month when the rent comes due? And she said, no, because this may be the only time in their life that they can have any association with the church. And maybe there will be something here they can remember. And so we had a lot of runaways in that area. We started making up lunch bags. We had a can of pork and beans in them, little cans. We'd have one of those cookies that are filled, little Mary Jane's or something, I don't know what. Well, anyway, we'd have one of those. It wasn't all nourishing food, but it was filling. And we would hand out 30 to 50 of those a day, of kids that had run away from home and were coming there. And I remember one day, this young woman came in. She was with a rather unsavory looking character that was probably 30 years her senior. And she was hungry. And I could tell he was a user. And she sat down in front of my desk and she said, I'm hungry and I need something to eat. I would love to go home, but I can't. And I said, why can't you? And she said, I come from the kind of family that won't want me back. And she said, I came here because my grandfather retired as a Methodist bishop. And she told me his name, and I remembered the name. I recognized it right off. He lived in the Northeast. And we Methodist preachers carry one of those little black books that's called the Daily Suggester in our pocket always. And in the front of that little black book, it has the name of every retired United Methodist bishop in America. And I took out my little black book and I looked in it. And there was the name. And he was staying in an assisted living facility. And I said, if I call him, will you talk with him? And she said, if he will talk with me. And I called. And I told him who I was, and I told him the purpose of my call, and I could tell the man was weeping. And he said, we haven't had any contact with her for 2 years. We didn't know who she was, where she was. Is she okay? And I said, well, she's a little bedraggled today, but I think she will be okay. And she wants to come home. And I said, we will buy the ticket. And he said, well, we will pay for the ticket times over whatever it is. And I said, no, that's our ministry here, Bishop, and we do it. And I sent the man that way, and we went to the church, went to the bus station and bought her a one-way ticket and saw her on the bus home. And I know she was received with arms of love and compassion and joy. And as I had done in West Virginia before, I'm a native West Virginian. I've been in Florida since 1970, but I'll never be anything but a West Virginian. I'm a hillbilly, and I'm proud. And I remember when I served my circuit, I started out with a circuit of 13 churches in West Virginia as a student pastor. Now, not all of them were active, but I preached 5 times every Sunday. And there was one of these churches where we had an establishment there that in that day and time it was referred to as the beer joint. And I drove by that place every day, back and forth. I had visited the people that lived out behind this side of it, that side of it, across the road from it, but I'd never been in that place. I thought I might be talked about. I was more careful about that then than I am now. But I know one day the urge just hit me as I started past that beer joint, and something said, Terry, you lousy, low-down coward, why don't you go in there and invite that man to church? And before I let myself think or talk myself out of it, I wheeled that little 63 Dodge Dart and threw gravel all over the place. He had his parking lot gravel, and I walked in. And as I walked in, I had never in my life seen as many one-armed Methodists as I saw that day. They all went this way. They all had a bottle in their hand, and that's the way they went, under the table. And I said, boys, relax, relax, I'm just visiting, and you have nothing to hide from me. And I walked up to the counter and I said to the man, I'm the new Methodist preacher, and I just wanted to come and invite you to church. And he looked at me like he was sort of astonished. And he said, well, I appreciate you stopping by. And we talked a few minutes, and I got up to leave, and he said, preacher, wait a minute. And he went over and opened the till and pulled out a $20 bill. That was a big thing then. And he said, you won't see me there Sunday, but I hope you'll put this in the plate for me. And I want you to know that I appreciate so much your stopping here today. You're the first preacher in my life that ever invited me to church. That's not a kick on anybody. I'd passed that place time and time again, but I just had the urge that day to do it. And I never did see the man in church, but a few months later I had his wife's funeral. And when we left here and we went to another town, and we were in that situation, and I know Georgine, bless her heart, she used to stop in there once in a while. She would be visiting relatives over there, and she would stop into the service. And Sam and Mary Jane Mansfield and several. I went there kicking and screaming, and I went there with an attitude that no preacher ought to ever allow to creep into his soul. Bitterness. Because I thought I was being punished for something, and I didn't know what it was for. And I declared when we moved in that a year later we'd move out. And I carried that kind of an attitude into a congregation that didn't in any way, shape, or form deserve it. And I fell in love with the people of God. And they supported me in just about any new ministry initiative I wanted to undertake there. We started a neighborhood watch. We sealed off the playground and painted the stripes and put up the basketball courts. We'd have a roller derby some Saturdays and have a disc jockey in, and we really tried to be a part of that community. But one block away, there were some of the roughest places that I've ever seen in my life. And I was sitting behind my desk one day, and that still small voice that can speak to our hearts and spirits once in a while said, "You need to go up to Main Street and make some calls." And sure enough, this one place I walked into, people said, "Don't go there. Don't go in there. They don't respect anybody. They won't respect you there due to the fact that you're a preacher." And there might be people in there because of what we've seen and heard and read and what comes out of there. A preacher walking through that door will be like saying, "Sick 'em to a bulldog." Don't go in there. But I went. And I pulled the same thing I did in West Virginia. I walked up to the bar. I said, "Give me a 7-Up." And the man said, "We don't have it." "How about an upper 10? I said, "Okay." I shook his hand and I said, "I'm the new preacher right out back here. I'm not trying to be cute, but I've heard about this establishment. And God loves it. Not what goes on here, but He loves you. And I wanted to come and invite you to church." And again, we talked a little bit. I was surprised. And folks, so help me, it happened twice, this same story. I know it's hard to believe. But he also handed me money and said, "Would you put this in the plate for me?" And as best I can remember, every quarter that we remained thereafter, that man sent a contribution to that church. Because he too said, "I've never been invited to church." I think this church is doing some wonderful things in the way of outreach. And I say these things this morning to try to encourage you because, my dear friends, this is the easiest hour we're going to spend this next week. When we get up from here and go through those doors, we're going out there into the highways and byways. And like Dietrich Bonhoeffer said we ought to do, we're going to be carrying our faith right downtown into the square of the marketplace. And he said we're supposed to stand there and be for Christ. And I believe we can we can do it. Back in the early 70s, I was in seminary, and there was a bishop out in California by the name of Gerald Kennedy. He was one of the most prolific writers of any bishop I've ever heard of. But he wrote a book that captured my imagination. The thesis of the book was, Christ came to bridge the gap between God and man, between man and man, and between a man and who he is in here. Jesus said to the scribes and the Pharisees, I'm bridging a gap. I want to bridge it from God to you, from you to these people, and everybody to God. I close with this. I went over the last time because this is what happens to me. But it was in West Virginia. We used to have revivals every spring, every fall. And it was at a revival meeting I was converted. A country preacher. He worked a secular job, and he was one of the most saintly men I can remember at that time in my life. But he told a story, and I don't remember if he told it firsthand or if he told it as something that had been told to him. But it was as if that night he were telling it to me. I heard it for the first time, and he said that there were two travelers on a train, a young man and an older man, and they were sitting across from each other. And the older man could not help but notice that the young man was he was just full of anxiety. He was just at the point he was almost beside himself, nervous. And the older gentleman said to him, son, you seem to be upset, distraught. Is there anything I can do? And he said, well, no. He said, several years ago, my father and I had a falling out. And I left home in a huff. And I've never talked with my father or mother since. I went out to the Midwest, and I've sort of made my way in life. I guess some people would rate me successful now. And I wrote to my mother early on last week and said to her that I was going to be traveling by on the way to another city. And I told her I would like to stop and see them both. I haven't heard, but as we go into the depot here, our farm is about a mile this side, and we have an apple orchard beside the railroad tracks. And I told her if it's okay with Dad for me to come home for a while, that I'd just like to see a ribbon waving from one of the branches in that apple orchard. And he said to the older man, I'm afraid to look. And the older man said to him, I tell you what, you bow your head, pray, whatever you want to do, and I'll watch for you. And as the train began to slow and they started drawing closer to the depot, the older man said to him, son, look up, look at this. You're not going to believe it. And the young man opened his eyes and looked out that rail car window, and there, flying from every tree in that orchard, was a big white ribbon that could not be missed. That's how God is. That's the God of this parable of the prodigal son. And as you leave here this morning, if you haven't discovered it before, I hope you will carry it in your hearts, that you nor I have ever done anything in our lives that God cannot redeem and forgive. And if you will note in this parable of the prodigal son, as the prodigal made his return, his father saw him coming over the horizon, and he didn't wait for him to get there. He ran to meet him. And Francis Thompson, that Catholic priest of long ago, wrote that poem, The Hound of Heaven, and said that the Father, the gracious, waiting Father, always runs to meet us, pursuing us like the hound of heaven. That's the gospel. Glory be to God. How fortunate we are to have such a great plan of salvation. May the Lord bless and keep you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.